Hey everybody, Joseph Rothschild here, aka MBT. As you can see, I am being slowly eaten by a new weapon developed by the CIA to destroy me one band of light at a time. So before that happens, I'm going to deliver to you the very first Master Duel tier list. Now I know what you're thinking. Joseph, what makes you an authority on the Master Duel metagame? Well, I host the Master Circuit series, and I watch a lot of competitive Master Duel, so probably nothing, to be honest. I'm just going to go on masterduelmeta.com and steal their tier list and re-upload it as my own and get X number of views. Anyway, for those of you who are interested enough in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! To try and figure out what is good in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s most popular way to play the game, but too stupid to figure out how to click on a Joshua Schmidt video, boy do I have the video for you. So, today we're going to be talking about what decks that you see below fall into what tier. And when I talk about tiers, I'm talking specifically about for tournament play, because there is a difference between tournament play and ladder. Just keep that in mind. When you disagree with something, it's because of the nuances and intricacies between ladder and tournament play, and not because I'm wrong. It's never because I'm wrong. Anyway, let's just get started, you know? First up, in tier 1 we have Pearly. I think this is pretty uncontroversial. Pearly is far and away the best deck in Master Duel right now, and it's not hard to see why. Though they are missing Little Noir, they have literally everything else at a full amount of copies. Pearly has an unbelievable ability not only in tournament play, but also in ladder to go both first and second, and it can main deck a lot of the powerful going second tools, because guess what? If you don't go second, you can just pitch them to the quick plays. What's more, Pearly in Master Duel has taken a very strange turn in that they have effectively engineered ways to play around the common boarded threats against the archetype. Gone are the days where you could set a quick play spell in order to play around something like a Herald of the Abyss. Instead, you can just make a Ghost Trick Angel of Mischief to confound it otherwise. I think probably before they release Little Noir, they're going to have to hit Pearly in some capacity. I like the Delicious hit that happened in the TCG, but I think we probably need something else as well. So many of the decks in Master Duel are already so neutered, I don't think anything can stand up to Pearly. Maybe they'll have to take a trip to the vet and get neutered themselves. Next up, nothing else in tier 1. That's right. In terms of most consistent, most capable threats, I think Pearly is probably the only thing worth playing. But there's some stuff you can consider as well. At the top of tier 2, we have got Dragonlink. This one's a little surprising. I think Dragonlink could theoretically go in the second or third place slot, but I think the deck is incredibly capable regardless of where you put it. Dragonlink has a lot of tools in Master Duel that they don't have in the TCG. Things like Chaos Ruler are unbelievably good for the strategy. They also have like more than one apiece of the Chaos Dragons. I don't know if you play more than one apiece, but it's crazy to even think that something like that is legal in any capacity. And while they don't have the full Bestial suite, they do have some of the Bestials, and the Bestials that they are playing to replace those Bestials actually improve a significant amount of its matchups. Baldrake has a really powerful effect you just don't see activated in the TCG very frequently. The reason that Dragonlink has a little bit of a problem in Master Duel, however, is because it is an insanely hard deck. Like, if you've watched the TCG tier lists, I believe Unchained piloted by a bad player and Unchained piloted by a good player are two completely different decks with different boarding strategies and principles for playing against them. I think that a mid-Dragonlink player will probably look like high potential, and a good Dragonlink player will look like an unkillable god. If you're a very skilled pilot, this is probably the deck for you. Next up, Labyrinth. So Labyrinth has gotten fewer tops recently than I think it deserves. Labyrinth is an incredibly powerful strategy in Master Duel specifically because it gets to completely avoid playing the Maxi minigame in a consistent amount of its games. It has unbelievable access to immediate win cards like Eradicator Epidemic Virus, or in a format dominated by Pearly, Dimensional Barrier. But it also loses to a lot. A significant amount of the cards that beat Pearly are singletons that you search off of Triple Tactics Thrust, and there's a lot of scenarios where you get yourself in a thrust war against the Labyrinth and are playing a Harpy's Feather Duster anyway that kind of frustrate this deck. What's more, this deck frequently just bricks. Like, if you ask a lab pilot, occasionally they will tell you the only thing that really defeats this strategy is you look at a hand of not relevant traps and think to yourself, why am I playing this instead of a deck in which every single card can make Striker Dragon? You know, it's good. It's a fine deck. And now that we've started by regurgitating the Master Duel meta tier list, let's deviate just a little bit. I think the other deck that belongs in tier 2 is Vanquish Soul. Now, Vanquish Soul just came out in Master Duel, and unlike its release in the TCG, it's got a significant amount of tools that Vanquish Soul just got in paper. Xiaolong came out Wave 1, which did not happen, although they did carry over the rarity spread from the TCG. Cool. Now, a lot of people are saying things in the chat like, oh, Prosby at 1, this deck is unplayable. And while it's true, this deck absolutely does need to find Raisin or Die. It's got a lot of mechanisms by which it can do it, especially in a world where Stake Your Soul, Your Nose is Mine can, of course, find Raisin off of a revealed Jiaolong. Let's talk about the reasons why this deck might be a little more playable in Master Duel than it is in the TCG. If you've been watching a significant amount of my videos, you know that one of the reasons why this deck was historically quite good in the OCG, but flopped in the TCG is because of Maxi. Maxi is an earth target for your Caesar Valius that you don't have to devote a whole bunch of main deck space to because you're already playing it. You know, you don't have to like go in on Fenrir, you don't have to consider playing Ghost Reaper in Haunted Mansion or Bell of the Ancient Ball of the terrible Earth Hand Trap. Maxi also helps this deck in another way. It's pretty good at playing around it. Frequently, you'll begin by normal summoning Raisin and your opponent will fire off a Maxi. That's not very good because you are very capable of just ending on Raisin. Or you can chain like a Borgor in hand to tag out, draw a card, pass to your opponent on 0 draws. You can also give them 1 draw, go into Rock of the Vanquisher, and guess what? That's kind of full combo. Vanquish Soul has only been out for 1 weekend in Master Duel, and already it's putting up results. Now, granted, those results are by some of Yu-Gi-Oh's top players, but I think in the coming weeks, you're going to see this deck really rocket to the top of the standings and be competitive versus Pearly, Dragonlink, and Labyrinth for sure. That's tier 2. Let's do tier 3. First up is Mathmech. Oh, I want this deck to be good so badly. So if you're wondering why Mathmech is being discussed at all, it's because it just got the Firewall stuff. You may remember in the TCG that Firewall Defensor and Firewall Guardian were supposed to be like new life into this ailing strategy, and then there was 1 weekend of Mathmech playability followed by nothing. That's because the strategy actually did not need these cards. The cards don't do anything for the deck that it wasn't doing already. That said, there are a lot of different things you can do with Mathmech. If you look at the most recent Master Circuit series, you can see that 4 Mathmechs cleared in the top 16, and I think 3 of them converted into top 8. The one that lost played a mirror. This deck's got a lot going for it. In a format where all of the other top decks are attempting to play a long, grindy game, this is the deck that uniquely attempts to end the game on turn 2, and a lot of those strategies aren't prepared for a deck to be that aggressive. Additionally, you can adapt with Mathmech. Your end boards can look different into different things, and importantly, you can even use the cards, Circular and the Firewalls, in different strategies to enable powerful plays. Just look at what I Wish I Was Dead was able to do with that Ignister. Firewall is back, and it's bigger than ever. Now, the problem with this strategy is all of its existing problems. It does have a line into Maxi, but it's not particularly powerful. It does have the ability to play through most hand traps, but you do have to open pretty well. It has a huge weakness to the Bestials, which you may recognize are 80% of the second best deck in the format. And in a tournament setting, you can bet in games 2 and 3, you will also have to contend with cards like Droll and Lockbird, which just spell absolute death for this archetype. But it's fine. You know, it's still OTKs. It's okay. Next up, Makonko. So I am a certified Makonko hater. You all know this. But I think Makonko has a lot of decent reasons to play it. So Makonko as a strategy hasn't yet integrated a lot of those going first plays that it's now famous for in the TCG. You know, we're not yet doing Ken and Gen stuff to make Acid Golem, but it is still an incredibly adept going second strategy. It can main deck Kaijus and OTK from a position of almost nothing, and in a format where the best deck, and probably the second best deck as well, kind of fold to Kaijus entirely, it's a really good position to be in. What's more, the interaction points from Makonko are not always obvious and usually have to do with spells and traps, against which a significant amount of the metagame is just not capable of dealing with. And like Mathmech, Makonko is not concerned with playing a long, grindy game, which gives it a real advantage over decks like Dragonlink and Labyrinth and Versus Soul that are attempting to do so. Add to that the fact that even in a ladder scenario, you are likely going to get your preferred position in terms of the coin flip every single game, and you've got a recipe for success. While in the TCG, Makonko did prey off of Kashtira a lot of the time because of Kashtira Arise Heart's weakness to Kaijus specifically, it also had a bit of a predator in that deck in Scareclaw Kashtira, a card that negates the effects of the Makonkos and can get in for lethal by attacking them a bunch of times with Kashtira monsters. Here, well, it doesn't really have to worry about that because Kashtira is not a very good deck. Next up, Sprite. Just like in the TCG, I don't really understand why Sprite isn't really good. Like, it's got most of the stuff that it needs to be competitive. I guess it's got 1 fewer starter, which is a decent hit. The problem with Sprite is the problem with Sprite in the TCG as well. It's got pretty clear, defined interaction points, especially in a format where it doesn't have access to Totally Awesome. It has a pretty low ceiling, which is unfortunate in a format where decks are going as hard as Pearly, Dragonlink are. It has a debilitating weakness to Max C that a lot of these decks have the capability to not play around, but at least play through to a degree. And it turns out all their monsters are light and dark also, so it also has the same weakness to Bystials that a lot of the other decks on this list do. That said, the deck is super consistent. I mean, it can make twos like nobody's business. It's just what you want to do with those twos isn't exactly well defined. I'm using Sprite here as a catch-all not only for Sprite pure decks, but also for Runic Furhire Sprite, which I think suffers a lot of the same problems as this strategy, with one additional exception, which is that deck doesn't have really any space for non-engine, and you need non-engine to beat Pearly. Next up, Branded. You might be surprised to see Branded at all. I'm a notable Branded hater, and Branded has one Branded fusion, which seems like a death knell for the archetype. But it isn't. Branded has consistent access to Branded Fusion by way of Bystial Serenir, sending something like a Retribution to the graveyard and then getting the Branded Fusion back from almost any position. There are a lot of builds of Branded that can theoretically do really well. The all-gas builds that were popular when Pack was piloting them are still around, and theoretically can play that Grasslook Screener, which is a really cool card. As much as I dunked on Scarlon for saying that the deck can play without access to Branded Fusion or resolution of it, it kind of can. I mean, it's got almost everything that it has in the TCG, including Blazing Cartesia, which really opens up a lot of options for the strategy. There's a couple of problems with Branded that warrant this position, however. It is, in essence, a combo deck with mid-range elements. It's trying to prevent your opponent from playing the game entirely, and if it fails to do so, it can fall back on some number of, like, Rindbroom and Mirror Jade and Gargwall, and decks are capable of beating that. What's more, it has a pretty diminished ability to go second. In the past, it really relied on cards like Guardian Chimera to clean up Gummy board states, but those cards don't do super well against a Pearly Noir, do they? You're going to frequently find yourself in Bystial Wars with things like Dragonlink. And there's a significant amount of decks like Labyrinth that just do not give a fuck if you make Mirror Jade. Oh my god, not Mirror Jade. Jesus. In a best of 3 scenario, you've got additional problems. Your opponent's going to be able to board into extremely targeted hand traps for your strategy, and all the cards that beat Pearly going first also beat you because Dimensional Barrier has a ton of text on it. The one thing that Branded does in Master Duel that I find particularly unique is plays a really expansive Nadir Servant line. Decks in the TCG are already experimenting with that as well, but it's cool to see it develop in Master Duel months before it did in the TCG relative to the time frame that cards are being released online. That card's really strong. Next up, Naturia. This one's strange. Naturia has a lot of cards that make it good. While there are hits to the strategy, they're not lights out. Like, the gameplay loop still exists. I couldn't really put my finger on why I think Naturia Runic isn't, like, a top-tier deck in Master Duel, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that, like, there are decks that can win the game without ever activating a spell card, which makes going for Naturia Beast blind not particularly powerful. The Runic cards being all at 2 means that there are scenarios in which you want to be able to potentially guarantee you're drawing live off the top of your deck, but you can't do so because a significant amount of the cards you're going to draw are not the ones that you would prefer to. You also kind of have to dive deep into the pool of Runics. I've seen people playing like Golden Droplets, which you really don't want to have to do in this deck. It's got more space than other comparative Runic decks like Runic Furhire for non-engine, but at the end of the day, you want your Runic fountain to always be live, and for that reason, you're playing a critical mass of Runic spells, which competes with your ability to out cards like a Pearly Noir. The number one reason I think this deck is just not played as well is because it tests a skill that players usually aren't familiar with being tested. You can burn through your resources in deck using the effect of Mole Cricket in about 2 seconds, and a lot of players don't consider a long game when doing so. That means that more reserved players who are more familiar with playing a more control style of deck will see a lot more success with this than ladder Andes. When Joshua Schmidt plays this deck, it looks unbeatable, but when anyone else does, it looks exceptionally beatable. And that concludes Tier 3. For those of you following along at home, that means that every remaining deck is going to end up in the high potential category. And let's begin with the highest potential of all, Kashtira! Lo, how the mighty have fallen. Kashtira was like a day 1 ladder Andy deck. It wins or loses its games extremely quickly. It just does the one thing really fast. And that one thing does frequently win the game. but not always. Kashtira's got a ton going against it. First and foremost, a number of decks just do not care at all about the macrocosmos that Kashtira Arise Heart presents. At the time of Arise Heart's release in the TCG, the only other deck worth playing was Tierlist, so it looked really, really good by comparison. The numbers don't work out perfectly for Kashtira in Master Duel. The field spell being limited, the inability to search terraforming off of Thrust, Prosby at 1 all mean that it's kind of hard to find your combo. Frequently, you're just staring at a hand that's got like 2 copies of Rise Heart in it and crying. Like in the TCG, a lot of these decks are playing Fenrir natively, which means that because Arise Heart is legal for everyone, not just you, they can just make their own Arise Heart if you've activated the effect of Shangri-Ira immediately. And as Pearly became more popular, this deck, which was having a little trouble in tournaments but doing okay on ladder, stopped doing okay on ladder as well. It turns out a lot of the cards that beat Pearly also beat Arise Heart. Noir is a big ass Xyz with a bunch of materials, but it has protection. I mean, Arise Heart's just a guy. As a result, this deck has had a really fantastic drop-off, and I would not recommend it going into any tournament setting. While it was one of the top 3 most played things at the most recent Master Circuit Series, not a single copy made it into top 16, nor did it make it into top 16 last 2 weeks when it was the most represented deck in Swiss. I think this deck is not suitable for a tournament setting. I don't think you have to devote much side deck space to it that you're not already devoting to Pearly. And I think the deck is just boring as shit anyway. Play a fun deck. Do something enjoyable with your life. Next up. This one hurts me so bad. I don't know how they did it. But Konami has figured out a way to keep Kitcolos legal and make Tierlist bad. It's shocking. It really is. The hits in Master Duel are so unbelievably comprehensive. I think it's Merly at 0, Havness at 1, Shiren at 2, the field spell at 1, no terraforming. I mean, all of the millers are banned. The shufflers are legal. It's rough. They limited Suliak for fuck's sake. Now, that's not to say this deck is unplayable. Certainly, it still has its home on the ladder and in tournaments where extremely skilled players can take advantage of the fact that Kitcolos is legal and Chaos Ruler is legal, and theoretically you can still mill Snow. But at the end of the day, it is an extremely inconsistent deck that doesn't have nearly the explosivity that it has in the TCG or prior to the ban lists in Master Duel. It can get run over by decks that go bigger than it. It can brick against decks that are worse. The strategies that are more consistent can interrupt it at critical junctures because now it has choke points, and unfortunately it doesn't have the wealth of interactions that it had in the past because it can't guarantee all of those points of interaction make it into the graveyard by way of 0 millers total. There are some games in which this deck looks unbeatable, where you mill like a god and your opponent feels like they are playing in 2022. They are just becoming fewer and farther between. Next up, I feel bad putting Sword Soul this low. Sword Soul's fine. It's a great deck. Especially for ladder, you can just load up Long Wan and burn your opponent out of the game. As someone who has a lot of psychic damage done to them by Sword Soul, courtesy of Doug Zeef, I know that this deck is very powerful. There's even some reasons in Master Duel why it's more powerful than it would be in the TCG. You can use Emergence to search Protoss if you already have access to your combo. I mean, it seems good. Unfortunately, once you look at the top 4 decks, it becomes immediately clear why this strategy isn't as strong as it is in the TCG. Decks like Labyrinth will just set cards like Compulse that just win them the game on the spot. Decks like Dragonlink can banish Ashanas from the graveyard with the Bestials and will overwhelm you with negates if they're allowed to go first. And the deck doesn't have a very good answer to, well, exactly a Pearly Noir. It does one thing. It does it with really striking consistency. And if it's running hot, it can absolutely beat opponents who have drawn poorly. But at the end of the day, the thing that has prevented this deck from being a top contender in this metagame isn't anything like ban lists. It has nothing to do with the deck's inherent strengths. It just kind of got power crept. I think we can put Long Wan a 3, though. That's absurd that he's not there already. Next up. Now we're getting to the real stinkers. So Scareclaw is a really strange deck. The thesis behind Scareclaw is that Tryhard is an incredibly powerful card. And that's the end of the thesis for Scareclaw. Now, this was enough early into Kashtira's release because Kashtira doesn't have a really good answer to Tryhard, and so there were a lot of scenarios where you just played Towers Turbo. But now that Kashtira is like pretty universally recognized as a kind of mid-strategy, the reason to play this deck has become a lot less compelling. Sure, it does have the ability to play a Sword Soul style of gameplay where you end on like their on-theme blackout and like once per turn your powerful Tryhard can't be destroyed by card effects. But this is a format where everyone's playing like Thrust and like Talents. And you can really just easily lose the game immediately via someone taking your very powerful Tryhard. I think the legacy of this deck is going to be that Tryhard is an impressively powerful card that's being played in better decks than Scareclaw. Next up. So similarly to how there was an argument for playing Scareclaw when Kashtira was like the best deck, the reason to play Exo Sister was that Tyr was the best deck. And that reason is vanished entirely. Now, that's not to say that Exo Sister doesn't still have good matchups. All of the decks in the top 4 do interact with their graveyard. But that's really not enough. Exo Sister still plays a game that's very low to the ground. They aim to set a lot of powerful trap cards to make up for the difference between the power of their deck and the power of the other top decks. And most decks are already prepared to deal with powerful back row because they're playing around Labyrinth already. Add to that the fact that this deck has a really big weakness to pretty much exactly Triple Tactics Talent, and you have a stew for a high potential archetype. We'll say high potential. Next up. Oh, man. They are doing everything they can to prevent me from playing Flu. Flu is fine. The argument for Flu in Master Duel is pretty clear. AoE Book of Moon is incredibly powerful. I mean, look at the top 4 decks. All of them have a problem with that effect in particular. If you need more evidence, look at how many people are splashing Daruma Karma Cannon for Thrust. This deck never special summons, which means it just gets to opt out of the Max C minigame, deading a significant amount of cards in your opponent's deck. And in games 2 and 3, there's no guarantee that they're going to have the necessary amount of cards to take out all of the cards that they have in their main to deal with that setup. M-Pen is an impressively powerful card in any format where people are playing Links. And when Dragonlink and VS are 2 of the top 4 strategies, boy, is that a good sell. Harpy's Featherstorm. It's legal. However, Konami has done everything in their power to prevent this deck from being playable in any capacity. 1 Prosby. 1 map, 1 M-Pen, 2 Shifter. I mean, they just limited extravagance. What more can you do to us? Listen, I think there is an argument for playing a deck that's got main deck Shifter this format. I just think that deck is called Vanquish Soul. And finally, Runic Stun. This deck had a... Didn't this deck just win Duelist Cup? It had a... This deck just had an impressive finish in the Duelist Cup, and I really wanted to use this deck not as an indictment of that Duelist, who absolutely performed out of their mind, but I do want to use it as a discussion of how the ladder is a different format than Best of 3. Once the side deck is in play, Runic Stun is not a very scary deck. A lot of the cards that you're boarding for Labyrinth are going to absolutely cook this deck alive. But if you're in a ladder scenario and you are expecting your opponent to play stuff like Pearly instead of stuff like Labyrinth, this deck can very easily steal a lot of games. It steals them fast, and it loses games fast too. So you get to churn through a ton of them and rack up DP. Once your opponent knows what you're doing, it's less good. So that's my list. Feel free to disagree with it. I know that you all do. I've been reading chat. I know you all have problems with it. If you can correctly identify those problems and write them in the comments, I would appreciate it. And now, my favorite part of every tier list video, where we go through all of the decks that didn't make it onto the tier list in the first place, and I tell you why I didn't do so. What are we working with, chat? Where's Rika? It topped UN Farfa tournament? No, it didn't. Rika did not top the MCS just now. What? Master Duel is an international video game. If only Europeans could play, I'm sure Rika would be tier 1. Rescue Ace? Oh. Wait till we get Preventer and Emergency, then we'll talk. Generators. This isn't Remote Duel Regional. Trap Tricks, dog. Yeah, for sure. Where's Nouvelle? Where is Nouvelle? Unfortunately, Nouvelle is too new, so we weren't able to get a good read on its power level. I would say probably tier 0. Tier -1, perhaps? Where Pendulum? Where is Pendulum? It's crazy that Heavy Metal Foe's Electromine is legal and a Pendulum deck isn't in the top 30 of strategies you can be playing in this game. I'm going to blame it on Shangri-Era, but I think its problems go a little deeper than that. Cyber Stew. Mathmech's on there. Same deck.